The biggest star on the face of the earth was standing in a room, and across that room at a table sat a black man from Georgia, and everything about the time they lived in, every unwritten rule of that era, said the two of them were not supposed to cross the floor to each other. Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll, the most famous entertainer alive, and James Brown was the king of soul, the hardest working man in show business. But in the America of that moment, those two crowns were not supposed to touch. There was a way these things were done. The powerful white star does not get up. If anything happens at all, the other man is brought to him, quietly, and it's a favor. Everyone in that room understood the choreography. And then Elvis Presley did something that stopped the room cold. He stood up, and instead of having James Brown brought over to him, he said, "Take me to James." And he walked across that floor, in front of everyone, to the other man's table, and extended his hand in public. This is the story of a friendship that America's rules said should never have existed. Two men called kings, who found in each other the one thing neither of them could get from the millions of fans screaming their names, an equal. Stay with me, because it ends years later in a room at Graceland, with the toughest, hardest, most feared man in music sitting motionless in a corner, unable to speak. And what broke James Brown that day tells you everything about what these two men really were to each other. Let's go back and understand why that walk across the room mattered so much. Because to see it clearly, you have to see the world it happened in. Elvis and James Brown came up in the same America on opposite sides of a line that was drawn through everything. Same music at the root. Both of them soaked in gospel, in the black church, in rhythm and blues. Elvis, a poor white kid from Tupelo, Mississippi, listening to black radio and black gospel, and building something out of it that made him the most famous man on the planet. James Brown, a poor black kid from Augusta, Georgia, who shined shoes on the sidewalk and was sentenced to hard labor at 16 and clawed his way up from nothing. Two boys from the bottom of the American South, both of them raised on the same sounds, both of them rising to wear a crown. But the country that made them rich did not treat their crowns the same way. Elvis could go anywhere, play anywhere, stay anywhere. James Brown, at the height of his fame, still had to think about which hotels would take him, which rooms he could walk into, which doors were closed no matter how many records he sold. Same talent, same gospel roots, same royalty. Two completely different Americas, and that is exactly why what Elvis did carried so much weight. Because he didn't have to do it. Nothing in the world required the king of rock and roll to get out of his chair for anyone. He could have sent an assistant. He could have nodded across the room. He could have done nothing at all, and no one would have blinked, because that was simply how the hierarchy worked. Instead, when the chance came to meet the King of Soul, Elvis didn't make James Brown come to him. He said, "Take me to his table, and he crossed the floor himself, and he put out his hand where everyone could see it. To James Brown, a man who had spent his entire life being made to use the back door, being told where he could and couldn't stand, that gesture was not small talk. It was the single thing the world had spent his whole life denying him, being treated, in public, in front of everyone, as an equal. He never forgot it. He talked about it for the rest of his life, and there's a small detail in how it happened that makes it even better. It wasn't Elvis being introduced to some unknown. When the man who arranged it asked Elvis if he even wanted to meet James Brown, Elvis didn't hesitate. He said yes immediately, because Elvis Presley was, at his core, a fan of great music, and he knew exactly who James Brown was and exactly how great he was. And then, given the choice of how to do it, have James brought to him the way it was always done, or go himself, he chose to go himself. That choice is the whole story in miniature. The most famous man alive, who could have had anyone in the world walk to him, decided that this was a man worth walking to. In a country that had spent James Brown's entire life telling him he was less, the single biggest star in it looked at him and decided he was more than an equal. He was someone to honor. Now, here's what most people get completely wrong about these two men, and it's the thing that turned a polite introduction into a real, deep, decades-long friendship. People assume Elvis and James Brown must have been rivals. Two kings, same territory, both fighting for the same throne. That's the obvious story. It's also completely wrong, because the truth is that at the very top, at the absolute peak of fame where these two men lived, it is the loneliest place in the entire world, and there were almost no other human beings on earth who could understand it. Think about it. Who could Elvis Presley actually talk to? Who understood what it was to be that famous, that watched, that trapped inside your own myth, that unable to walk down a street or eat in a restaurant or have one normal human moment? Almost no one. And who could James Brown talk to on the other side of that line, carrying the exact same impossible weight? The two of them recognized something in each other that the screaming millions could never give them. Here, finally, is somebody who actually knows. Not a fan, not a hanger-on, an equal. James Brown put it as plainly as it can be put. He said he wasn't just a fan of Elvis, he was his brother. He said, Elvis told me I was good, and I told him he was good, and we never argued about that. Two of the most competitive, ego-driven performers who ever lived, and with each other there was no competition at all, just recognition. And this is where the friendship becomes something almost nobody knew about at the time, because they kept it quiet and they kept it real. This wasn't a photo-op friendship. James Brown became one of the very few people that Elvis Presley trusted with his private phone number at Graceland. And if you know anything about Elvis, you know what that meant. Graceland was his fortress. It was the one place in the world where he could stop being Elvis Presley the product and just be a man. He did not like Hollywood types. He did not open that door to just anybody. He kept it for family and for a tight circle of people he genuinely trusted. And James Brown was on that list. When Brown was passing near Memphis, he could call the house directly and try to catch Elvis at home. And what did the king of rock and roll and the king of soul actually do when the cameras were off and the crowds were gone and it was just the two of them? They didn't party. They didn't compare record sales. They sat together, sometimes for hours, and they sang gospel. The two most explosive performers of their generation, the man who invented the pelvis-shaking rock and roll show, and the man who invented funk itself, sitting quietly at Graceland singing the old church songs they'd both grown up on opposite sides of a color line, in the one room where none of that mattered anymore. That's not a rivalry. That's two brothers who found their way home to the same music. Picture that room for a second, because it's one of the most extraordinary images in American music, and almost no photograph of it exists. Late at night, Graceland quiet, no band, no audience, no press, no handlers, just a piano, maybe, and two voices. And these two men, who between them had sold more records and shaken more bodies and terrified more parents than almost anyone in history, are not doing any of that. They're back where they both started, in the pews, singing Peace in the Valley, singing the songs their mothers sang, the songs that got them through the poverty and the shame and the long climb up. When Elvis sang gospel, he wasn't Elvis anymore. When James Brown sang gospel, he wasn't the Godfather anymore. They were just two poor Southern boys who loved God's music and who had traveled about as far from those pews as two human beings could travel, and found, to their own surprise, that the only person who could walk all the way back there with them was each other. That is the friendship, not the fame, the trip home. So they had it, this rare, quiet, real thing that almost no one else in the world could offer either of them. And then, in August of 1977, it ended the way these stories always end too soon. Elvis Presley was found dead at Graceland. He was 42 years old. Now, James Brown was not a soft man, and this channel has never pretended otherwise. This is the man who fined his own musicians on stage for a wrong note, who replaced his entire band overnight rather than lose a negotiation, who could stare down a line of police officers and give them orders. He was, by the accounts of nearly everyone who worked for him, one of the hardest, most controlled, most unbreakable men in the entire music industry. He did not fall apart. Falling apart was not something James Brown did. When he heard Elvis was gone, he said simply, "That's my friend. I have to go." And he went to Graceland. He asked if he could come during the private viewing before the world was let in. And he was, by the account of those who were there, the very first of the major artists to arrive and pay his respects. And the man who walked into that house was not the godfather of soul, not the hardest working man in show business, not the tyrant, not the king. Those who were in the room remember being genuinely taken aback by how devastated he was. This unbreakable man walked in, and he could barely function. And he went to a corner of the living room, and he sat down, and he stayed there, motionless, for a long, long time, unable to speak, unable to join the others, just sitting, alone in the corner of his friend's house, with his friend gone. The toughest man in music, undone completely, in a way almost no one had ever seen him, and almost no one ever would again. Think about what it takes to bring a man like that to that state. James Brown had buried a lot in his life. He had survived poverty that would have killed most people, survived prison, survived an industry built to break men exactly like him, and he had done it all with that iron, unyielding will. And here he was, folded into a corner of Graceland, broken because the one man on earth who had treated him as a true equal, who had gotten out of his chair and crossed a room and a color line to shake his hand in public, was gone. And even then, he wasn't finished honoring him. Not long after Elvis died, James Brown went into the studio and recorded his own version of "Love Me Tender," one of Elvis's most beloved songs, and on it he added a spoken introduction straight from the heart. He said he wanted to talk about a good friend he'd had for a long time and a man he still loved, Brother Elvis Presley. Not a competitor, not the other king. Brother. So what do we take from all of this? Because the easy version of James Brown, the one even we've told parts of on this channel, is the hard man, the ruthless boss, the ego that couldn't stand to be second in any room. And all of that is true. But this story is the other half of the same man, and you don't get to understand him without it. The same pride that made him impossible to work for was the pride of a man who had been disrespected his entire life and refused, absolutely refused, to accept it. And when someone finally offered him the opposite of disrespect, when the biggest star in the world stood up and honored him as an equal, freely in public when he didn't have to, that same intense man returned it with a loyalty and a love so deep that it flattened him completely when it was taken away. The hardness and the tenderness were never two different men. They were the same man, shaped by the same wound. One made him a tyrant, the other made him a brother. Two kings from opposite sides of a line, America drew through everything. And in the end, the only throne either of them really wanted was a corner of the other one's house, and an old gospel song, and someone who finally, truly, knew. The world remembers them as rivals for the same crown, the king of rock and the king of soul, forever pitted against each other in the record books. The world was wrong. They were never fighting over a throne. They were the only two people who could stand at the top of that lonely mountain and reach across the one line that was never supposed to be crossed, and hold on. And when one of them let go, the other one, the hardest man in music, sat down in a corner and could not get up. Subscribe for more true stories from music's greatest legends, and tell me in the comments, who's the one unlikely friendship in history that surprised you the most?